Under the blazing summer sun of the American countryside, David drove his weathered pickup truck slowly along a lonely red dirt road that stretched endlessly between dry cornfields and abandoned barns. Heat waves shimmered across the horizon while clouds of dust spiraled behind his tires like smoke, trailing from an old locomotive. The countryside felt frozen in time. Broken windmills stood motionless in forgotten fields. Fences leaned sideways from decades of storms, and rusted machinery rested silently beneath tall grass that had long ago reclaimed the land. For most people, places like this felt empty. To David, they felt alive. For nearly 10 years, he had traveled through forgotten rural towns searching for abandoned machines, old tractors, rusted pickups, and relics that time had left behind. He had restored dozens of vehicles already. Old farm trucks, military jeeps, vintage motorcycles, and even a fire-damaged school bus from the 1950s. But to David, restoration was never just about machinery. Every dented hood carried memories. Every cracked steering wheel had once been held by human hands. Every faded emblem represented a story waiting to breathe again. People often laughed at him for spending thousands of hours reviving vehicles most considered worthless junk. Scrapyards saw metal. David saw history. And on that blazing afternoon, he was about to discover something unlike anything he had ever found before. He had just finished exploring a nearly abandoned farming town buried deep in the countryside. Population less than 200 people. The town had once thrived decades earlier when local farms flourished, but now most buildings sat empty. Storefront windows were boarded shut. Gas stations had collapsed into weeds. Only a handful of elderly residents still remained. David was preparing to leave when something caught his eye beyond a broken wooden fence near the edge of a large, overgrown property. At first he saw only weeds. Then suddenly a massive rusted shape emerged beneath the tall grass. David immediately slowed the truck. His heart began beating faster. Half hidden beneath decades of neglect sat an enormous 1946 International KB6 truck. Even from a distance he could tell it was special. The truck rested silently beneath layers of dirt and vines like a forgotten monument from another era. Rust covered nearly every inch of the body. The once bright paint had faded into a mixture of dull brown and gray. Tall weeds wrapped around the wheels like nature itself was trying to swallow the machine whole. Yet despite the decay, the truck still looked powerful. It still carried presence. David parked immediately. The moment he stepped out of his pickup, the dry summer grass crackled beneath his boots. Cicadas screamed loudly from nearby trees while hot wind swept dust across the property. Slowly, he approached the truck. The closer he came, the more unbelievable the discovery became. The front grille had been crushed inward from an old collision long ago. One headlight was missing completely. The windshield was badly cracked, and both front tires had sunk deep into hardened earth after sitting motionless for decades. But the shape of the truck remained unmistakable. David brushed dirt away from the hood carefully with trembling hands until faded chrome lettering slowly appeared beneath the dust. International. His eyes widened instantly. "My God," he whispered. He stepped back in disbelief. This is really a 1946 KB6. He could hardly believe what stood before him. These trucks had become incredibly rare. Most had long ago been crushed into scrap metal, stripped for parts, or simply rusted away beyond repair. Finding one at all was uncommon. Finding one mostly complete felt almost impossible, and yet somehow this one had survived. David slowly circled the truck. The doors barely hung on rusted hinges. Spider webs filled the window corners. Rust had eaten through portions of the fenders. One mirror dangled loosely beside the cab like it could fall off at any moment. Still, the truck carried dignity, like an old warrior refusing to die. David climbed carefully onto the running board and peered through the dirty side window into the cabin. Dust coated everything. The steering wheel looked ancient. The seats had completely rotted apart, exposing rusted springs underneath. Broken wires dangled beneath the dashboard like dead vines, but somehow, despite everything, the truck still felt alive. David opened the driver's door carefully. The hinges screamed loudly. A cloud of dust exploded into the sunlight. Inside, the smell of mold, rust, oil, and old leather filled the air instantly. It smelled like history. He sat carefully behind the wheel. The enormous steering wheel felt cold beneath his hands. David stared at the dashboard for several long seconds before finally noticing the odometer. 43,012 miles. His eyes widened again. A truck this old only has 43,000 miles. That made no sense. Most working farm trucks from that era had hundreds of thousands of miles before retirement. Something about this story felt unusual. David stepped back out and looked around the property. Someone had to own the land. After asking at several nearby houses, he was eventually directed toward an old farmhouse overlooking distant fields. Sitting quietly on the porch was an elderly farmer wearing faded overalls and a worn-out straw hat. The old man looked thin and weathered by time, but his eyes remained sharp. When David mentioned the truck, the farmer chuckled softly. "You're the first person to ask about that old thing in years." David smiled. "How long has it been sitting there?" The old farmer leaned back slowly in his chair and looked toward the distant field. "Almost 50 years." David stared at him. 50? The man nodded. "Hasn't moved since 1977. David could hardly process that. "Half a century." The old farmer smiled faintly. "That truck belonged to my wife." David listened quietly. "She drove it all over this county back in the day. Delivered crops, feed, tools, whatever folks needed." A gentle smile crossed the farmer's face as memories returned. She loved that truck more than anything. Then his expression darkened slightly. "Until the accident." David immediately thought about the crushed grill. The farmer nodded slowly. "She got hit on an icy road one winter morning. Truck survived better than she did." Silence settled across the porch. David lowered his eyes respectfully. "She passed away a few years later," the old man said quietly. "After that, I just parked the truck." He sighed deeply. "Couldn't bring myself to touch it again." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Wind rustled through the dry fields surrounding the farmhouse. Finally, David looked back toward the truck. Most people would have seen nothing but a hopeless pile of rusted metal slowly sinking into the earth. But David saw something different. He saw history. He saw memories. He saw a machine that deserved another chance. After nearly an hour of conversation, the old farmer suddenly looked directly at David. "If you really want to save it." He paused. "You can have it." David blinked. "For free?" The old man nodded slowly. "I'm too old to fix it now, and the county plans to clear this property next year anyway." He looked toward the truck again. "I don't want it crushed." David felt something tighten in his chest. He extended his hand immediately. "I promise," he said quietly. "I'll bring it back to life." The old farmer shook his hand firmly. "Then it's yours."